So one of the questions I get a lot is columns versus grid in Oxygen. Columns has been around for a while. Grid is relatively new inside of Oxygen. They have a grid builder, but there's also an easier and much simpler way to get grid-based layouts, and that is with OxyNinja's core grid classes, which I'm going to show you how those work as well. But we really have to talk about the old columns element and all of the problems and limitations with it, because there are many. And really what the columns element is doing is just creating a CSS Flex container to put divs in, and then it's auto choosing the column width on those divs. It's just trying to do a lot of work for you, but it actually overcorrects, and I'll show you how it overcorrects, and it just becomes very problematic. But even if you did the CSS Flex container yourself to make columns, you would run into a lot of troublesome issues. And I'm going to show you the main issue, which is why I don't use the columns element in Oxygen hardly ever, and I don't use CSS Flexbox to try to create columns either. So strictly 100% grid, and I don't use the grid builder in Oxygen, but I will show you how it works. And then I'll show you how I actually build grids in Oxygen. I think I'm rambling yet again. This is a common problem. So let's just jump into the tutorial so I can show you how it works. All right, guys, we're going to talk about columns versus grid in Oxygen. And really what we're talking about is Flexbox versus grid in general, because the columns element in Oxygen uses Flexbox for its primary control. And you're going to see really the big downside of Flexbox and why I hardly ever use the columns element. And that there's actually more of a downside to the columns element in Oxygen, I think, than just traditional Flexbox, which I'm going to show you. And you're going to see why I barely ever use the columns element in Oxygen, and then why I don't really use Flexbox to create those like columnized, if that's a word, layouts. But let's go ahead and dive right in so that you can actually see instead of me just blabbering on and on and on. I'm going to add a section and a background color to the section just so you can see what we're working with here. And I'm going to add some content to the section. The main reason I'm going to add the content to the section is because in order to see one of the big downsides of columns and Flexbox is you have to see content around the columns. You'll see what I mean in just a second. So this is a heading, or let's just say these are our features. Wow, can't type today. All right, we're going to go with a text element next. This is how a basic, grid kind of style section would look with like feature cards or something. All right. So we're just going to quickly go to lorem ipsum and grab a little dummy text here. And I'm going to pop that in, and cool. And that looks terrible because it stretches all the way across. So I'm going to go ahead and go to advanced size and spacing, max width 720. And I tend to say, hey, never use pixels. All right, so why don't we just fix that real quick? 72 rem gets me the same exact thing. Cool. And now we're going to start doing our columns and grids and things like that. First, I'm going to put some spacing between these elements. I'm going to use owl spacing for this. If you don't know what owl spacing is, I made an entire tutorial on owl spacing. I'm going to make it pop up on the screen here, and then hopefully afterwards you'll remember to go click it and watch it because it's really cool. Basically, it evenly spaces out everything in a div or everything in a container evenly, like magic. All right, because you see spaces between these, and then anything else that I put in this section is going to be evenly spaced the exact same way. So I'm going to go ahead and add our columns element. Great. And you see a little gap there, right? Because we've got our owl spacing. And I'm going to choose the 33%, the 3-column layout. And there you go. And what a lot of people do when they're first using Oxygen is they say, hey, I need columns, and they see a columns element and they click it, and then they say, I need 3 columns, and there it is. And like everything looks fantastic, right? Wrong. Like lots of downsides here, lots of issues. To prove these downsides and issues, I'm going to now add a div. And we're going to use pure CSS Flexbox. I'm going to use the Oxygen controls, but we're just going to use Flexbox from the ground up. So I'm going to put 100% width on this. And then I'm going to put another div. And this is going to be for our grid. So I'm going to go ahead and put 100% on this. Cool. All right. So there we have our columns. And why don't we actually name things? Because, that's always a good practice so we can see exactly what we're working with here. So I'm going to hit Command A, and this is going to be called columns. It's kind of already called that. This is going to be called rename flex. Wow. Okay. Everything's super laggy, by the way, when I'm screen recording. I think I need a new computer. Flexbox, not flex body, Flexbox columns. And then this is going to be grid columns. Awesome. So we can kind of go for the same exact look with all three of these things and just see what the downsides are. We're going to start up here in the columns, and I'm going to add another div. We're going to add a card inside of here. Remember, these are feature cards. These are our features, right? So I'm going to add a card. I already have a utility class for this. I'll just use cCardLite, and I'm going to add an icon, and I'm going to add a heading. And I'm going to change that heading quickly to H3. And then I'm going to add text. And then I'm going to add a button. Great. And then I'm just going to use owl spacing on this. I'm not going to do this the way I normally would in real life because that's not the point of the tutorial. But now I have a card, right? And this is a feature. And we have lorem ipsum still loaded, locked and loaded in our clipboard. I'll make it a little smaller, and then this will be click here. So this actually looks like a real life basic icon card. Yes, we all agree? Cool. I'm going to go ahead and name it card because we want to stick with our naming stuff so we can see what everything is over here. All right, so in order to get this to the rest of the layout, I'm going to go ahead and select this inner column here, and I'm going to paste, and I'm going to select the outer, and I'm going to hit paste. And now we have our three columns. Okay. Before we talk, you already see one of the problems here. You're like, Kevin, that looks terrible. In fact, I'll go save this. We will preview it on the front end. And there's our cards. And we have no gap. They're all touching each other because there is no gap. Now, I do want to be fair. This would not behave like this for you in a default Oxygen install. If you've watched my tutorial on how to set up Oxygen properly, if you haven't done that, go watch it. I'm going to put a link to it. It's going to pop up here any minute. Go watch it after this video. But we're going to go to Manage Settings, Global Style. Oh, I'm already there. Cool. So under Global Styles, if you go to Sections and Columns, I clear out my columns padding because the reason is the default is like 20 pixels all around, right? I think that's the default. Don't hold me to it, but I think that's the default. And the problem is, you know, we see a gap now. So let's go reload this on the front end. You see a gap, but now we have a gap on the left and a gap on the right, which misaligns all of our content. This is not good at all. And this is the main way that you would create a gap between columns when you're using CSS Flexbox. And the reason is, if we go to caniuse.com, not canva.com, also a good resource, caniuse.com, and type in gap, we're going to see that our gap property for Flexbox is not really well supported. Okay, lots of browsers that are lagging behind in supporting the gap feature for Flexbox. And I think that's why it's not in there by default in Oxygen. Because if you look at the structure panel, if I click on my columns wrapper, you have like these settings where I can stack columns vertically and I can reverse the column order and I can set column width to 50%. Like I can do a lot of cool stuff, but I can't create a gap. And that's like the main thing I need to be able to do with columns is create gaps. Because you see when you add padding, it's not sufficient because it screws up the padding. It screws up the alignment of all the items in the section that you're working on. Now, there are other hacks that you can do where you can apply margin only to the right of columns and on and on and on. And you can do stuff with pseudo classes. Like it's hacky. It's very, very hacky. All right. And there's no reason. We don't have to because we have grid. But let me show you some other downsides of this. Here's one. So, sorry, I didn't even finish my thought, right? We went to that default area in global styles. I'm going to show you exactly why I clear these out. Because the 1% of the time that I do use these columns, I don't want default padding on them. Because if I want to change the padding, and let's say use a padding class, right? Like a utility class. Say I want large padding. Look, nothing happened. Because this default padding in Oxygen basically applies these at the ID level, right? So when I add a class to change the padding, it ignores it. And so I have no control over that. So what I would have to do is go into every single div and adjust padding manually here. And that's just not scalable, totally impractical, total, a killer of using this thing. So what I say to do when you're setting up Oxygen, is to go to sections and columns and just clear this out. Because at least now when I do use the columns, if for some reason I want to add padding in there, I can go choose my parent div. So that's this one right here. And I can add a padding class to it. Let's say large. Oh, no, that's overkill. Let's do medium. Or even small, gaps don't, can I type? Gaps don't have to be huge. Let's just add a small gap, right? And then let's say these other columns didn't exist. And now you're also going to see one of the problems that I have with the columns layout. First of all, you can see there's two cards now, and there's clearly not two columns in here. There's one column and a card inside the column. I can't even select this. I don't know. It's somewhat of a bug. Like if Elijah's watching this, investigate this, because when I was playing around with this earlier, this kept happening. So I'm going to duplicate that div, and now I've completely lost, because what the columns element in Oxygen does is it dynamically changes the width of the divs that are inside it. Remember, these were set to 33.33%. You didn't see me change this to 50. It changed itself to 50, right? If I put this back at 33, and I put this one back at that one. Okay, sorry. I'm making a mistake here of applying that to a class. We definitely don't want to do that. Be careful with your classes. All right. So it's actually at 100%. So it's got me all confused because it doesn't behave like it's supposed to behave. Like my brain's not making sense of it. So I'm going to go back to this ID and I'm going to change this 33.33. And then I'm going to choose this one. And we're going to go back to the ID and change. Look at that. That one went to 166. What is going on here? 33.33. And now we have our three columns back. But then we have that odd fourth thing, which isn't even in our freaking structure panel because it glitched out on us, right? To me, this is insanity, okay? So I'm just going to leave that there because it's a good demonstration of why you shouldn't use this columns element inside of Oxygen, in my opinion, okay? All right, sorry. I know that's a bug. I shouldn't make fun of bugs. I think it's a bug. I mean, it looks like a bug to me. In fact, I can't keep that there. Let's hide that for a second. That's a travesty. All right. So here we are. We have our Flexbox columns and our grid columns. I didn't even get to show you because this columns element broke. I was also going to show you that it doesn't respect Flexbox wrap the way that it's supposed to as well. I should be able to add 3 more divs in that Flexbox wrapper in that container, and it should break to a second column or a second row and have those 3 columns be on the second row. And it should look somewhat like a grid, but it doesn't respect wrap either. So this does. So Flexbox columns. Let me show you what the columns element in Oxygen is attempting to do. And it's like columns for dummies, which is why you can't really customize it much and why it breaks when you try to play around with it. So I'm going to take this div and I'm going to set the layout to horizontal on Flex. What that does, let me undo that. Because what you really should be doing, going to advanced layout, and let me clear it out so we don't have any issues in there. Okay. So layout, set the display to flex, set the flex direction to row, and then you can set the align items to, stretch. And then what I'm going to do is add a div. So this is exactly what the columns element was doing for you in Oxygen, but it doesn't do it the way that it's supposed to do it. So if I have this div and I set the percent to 33.33, that's what the others were, right? And I duplicate it twice, you're going to see I have exactly what Oxygen was trying to set up for me initially. But you're also going to see that it doesn't, number one, it doesn't break the way that you just saw that columns element break. So it does work properly. And it respects, let me go back to the wrapper, it respects wrap. So if I go to layout, and I choose this flex wrap, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate, and I'm going to duplicate, and I'm going to duplicate, and I can have 2 rows, and I can have what appears to be a grid. Now, this still doesn't solve my problem. Let me unhide this real quick because I want to steal my card. And then I'm going to hide it again so we can not see that travesty up there. And I'm going to paste my card in. And I'm going to paste my card in, and I'm going to paste my card in. All right. And we're going to see what our layout looks like here. And I want you to see that this gap problem is twofold. Not only do I not have gaps horizontally on the x-axis, I don't have y-axis gaps. I don't have gaps top to bottom between these elements. And if you did it with padding, again, you would still have a lot of alignment issues. Then you would have extra spacing above and below this whole container. That's not good. So you're going to see why we just use grid. And my general rule of thumb is that Flexbox is amazing for aligning content, and grid is amazing for laying out content. So if you want to think about it like that, think about it. Flexbox, I'll say it again. Flexbox is good at aligning content and items. Grid is great at laying out content and items, okay? So this is a layout, right? A 3-column, 2-row layout. That's for grid, right? Then I can do things inside of that using Flexbox. And that's a cool thing is Flexbox and grid can actually work together. And so you don't really choose one or the other. You use the grid to control the main layout, and then you can use Flexbox to do a lot of other cool things. And then there's some advanced things you can do with grid as well. Like you can control individual columns and rows with grid. You can span them. So if I wanted this to take up 2 columns, I could have it take up 2 columns. I'm not getting into like this is not a complete tutorial on CSS Grid or CSS Flexbox. This is just comparing the columns element to grid, which is Flexbox to grid. But you see here, I got somewhat of a grid, but I still have the gap issue. So what I'm going to do is come down here. And in fact, what I'm going to do is add one more div, because we're going to do this another way after we do it the manual way. And I'm just going to leave that div sitting right there, just so you can see. I'm going to show you how to make your life crazy easy and crazy fast with some utility classes. We're going to use grid utility classes. But let's just focus on this div right here. This is where I'm going to create my grid manually using Oxygen's grid controls. So remember, column count, what do we want? We want 3 columns, and we want a gap of, let's change this to rim, and I want a gap of 16 pixels, so that's 1.6 rim. If you've reset your, just go watch my tutorial on setting up Oxygen properly. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and add a div. And I'm going to add, I'm going to duplicate it. So I have 2 more, right? And actually, let me go back. What's actually cool about this, I don't need, and we'll talk about one of the other downsides of this. In order to create spacing around these things, generally you put the div card, the card wrapper div inside of the column div. And so now you've doubled your DOM elements, right? So you have a div inside a div. Well, when you use grid, you actually don't need a containing element, right? I can just have, because I don't have to use padding or anything to create my gap. So what I can do is I can just paste a card in there. I think I have my card. Yeah, so there it is. Let me go ahead and let's put more owl spacing on here. Let's do owl spacing _L. It's like for large spacing, so we can get more space between these things. Okay, so there's my card. It doesn't need its own wrapper. It's just there as my card, because when I duplicate it, it's going to naturally have a gap between the items, right? So, and then here's the cool thing about grid, right? If I just keep duplicating, I don't have to even set a wrap. It just knows, like, keep going, like just keep making the grid, right? That's really, really cool, really, really helpful. So now you see I have perfect alignment. Let me turn off these Flexbox columns. We have perfect alignment with our other content in the section. There's no extra padding on the left, no extra padding on the right, no extra padding on the top or the bottom. It's behaving exactly as you would expect a layout like this to behave. And all I did was a couple clicks of the mouse. I hit grid, I hit 3 columns, I hit 1.6, and that's actually should be rem. You can also control the gap here, because we want those gaps to be even, right? So it's 1.6 left and right. We want it to be 1.6 top and bottom as well. And then down here is where you can start getting into like how you want individual children of this grid to behave. All right, but we're not going to mess with that for right now. I just want to show you the main thing, the main problem with the columns element. Number one is that it breaks if you start playing around with it too much. It auto changes the width of the divs that are inside it. It just goes, it's crazy making. If you make a Flexbox columns wrapper on your own, it doesn't break, and it does respect the Flexbox wrapper gap property, but you still have the problem of not having a gap. And, like I said, if you add the gap manually, you have the browser support issue. So grid fixes, that's like the main thing that grid fixes, and it's really, really easy. Now, the problem with grid, one problem with grid, like Flexbox naturally, especially if you use the columns thing, is more responsive. Like grid, it's going to have these 3 columns. It sets the min width of each item in here, of each child element. You can set that to whatever you want. But what you're going to see is that when I go down, all it does is squish them. So now it does, so now it's going off the screen. I don't know if you guys can see that. Yep. So now I can't even fit all 3 things in here. So that's obviously a problem. And this is one reason why people are like, I don't really know how to use the grid thing. It's like, it's breaking. So all you have to do really is come in here to, let's say this. All right, that looks good. So we'll go the next breakpoint down and we'll say, all right, on this breakpoint, I'm going to have the grid turned on and I'm just going to go to column count 2 at this breakpoint. And that solves your problem, right? And then what I'm going to do is go down here to 768 and I'm going to say, those look really squished. I'm going to go ahead, grid, and I'm going to go column count 1. All right. This is one way of doing this. There's other ways of doing this. This is probably the simplest way, or at least the more straightforward way, is going to the breakpoints and figuring out what you want the breakpoints to be. So here's where I'm going to make your life super, super, super easy. Okay. Remember that little div sitting there that we had? Okay. Oh, wait, hold on. Before we hide that, let me steal one of my cards. Okay. Because I don't want to have to rebuild that again. All right. And we're going to hide this. Wow. It's getting super laggy. Anytime I'm screen sharing, super laggy. All right. So I'm going to click this div right here and I'm going to come up here and I have OxyNinja installed. And what the most powerful part of OxyNinja, see, when beginners are looking at OxyNinja, they're going to be looking at the layout packs. Like, ooh, look at all these layouts I can install. I'm just going to be honest with you, I almost never use the OxyNinja layout packs. The only reason I install OxyNinja is for the core class system, all of the utility classes that it comes with. And some of the most powerful utility classes in OxyNinja, I'm going to have a link below to OxyNinja in the description. It is an affiliate link, so if you want to support this channel, I don't ask you for donations or anything like that. It's just if I show you something cool and it's a third-party tool and it costs money and you have to buy it, you can use my affiliate link if you want to, help me out. If you don't want to help me out, if you hate me, if you don't like my tutorials, if you just want to steal my content, whatever, that's all fine and good too. Don't use the affiliate link. Just go to oxyninja.com. I think that's their site. But if you do want to support the channel, you can click the affiliate link in the description. So watch me just make this grid, right? So how many columns do I want? 3. So I'm going to type in the word columns and I'm going to do -3. And I'm just going to choose the 3 columns. Okay. And then I'm going to add a div. Actually, sorry, I'm not going to add a div because we don't even need wrappers in here. I'm just going to paste my card. And then I'm going to duplicate my card. Boom. Now I'm going to choose my parent wrapper. And I'm going to say, you know what? I'd like a gap between those things. I'd probably like a medium gap. So I'm going to do gap-m. And I'm going to see, I had a lot of options there, but because I put m, it's going to take me right to m. So there's my gap. If you want a bigger gap, let's take away the gap m and let's do gap L. And now I'm going to have a larger gap. There it is. Now I think that gap is a little too large. And you can adjust these, by the way. You can make them whatever you want, but I'm going to go back to gap M. And let's say remember we wanted 6 cards initially. So I'm just going to duplicate this 3 more times. And so I have my cards with my gaps. Now let's control the mobile spacing. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to come down here and look at, and just to give you a reference here, in OxyNinja's utility classes, this breakpoint is considered XL. This is considered L, M, and S. So let's look at how it looks on XL. Looks fine. So here's where it starts to look squished. So that's L. So I'm going to come to the overall. I'm just going to guess here, right? Just for now. So I'm going to type in L2, which means at the large breakpoint, I want 2 columns. Okay, so I'm going to choose that. And then I'm going to say M-1. At the medium breakpoint, I want 1 column. Fam, I'm done. I have a responsive grid, guaranteed. Right? I don't even have to look at it right off the bat. I've done this so many times, I already know it's all good to go. So if I look at the XL, we still have our 3. If I look at the L, we have 2. And if I look at the M, we have 1. And then at the S, it just adapts to the M. It keeps the M sizing, right? So I have a fully responsive grid with controllable gaps, no extra spacing left or right, no extra spacing top or bottom. Didn't have to touch a single control inside of the Oxygen panel. Didn't have to know anything about really how grid works. I just slapped on some utility classes. I said, hey, I want 3 columns. On large devices, I want 2 columns. On medium devices, I want 1 column, and I want a gap between them that looks like this. Now, you can do other stuff with the utility classes. I'll do an entire OxyNinja grid utility class tutorial at some point that shows you how to make fancier grids and stuff like this. But this is what I do every single time when I'm creating layouts like this where I need columns and rows, is I use OxyNinja grid classes, and it's done in seconds. And I don't have to finagle with Oxygen's columns thing. I don't have to put up with all the downsides of trying to do this with Flexbox. I just use grid and I move on with my life. It's that easy. Now, if you are doing something like an image-based grid where all you're going to have is images or image cards, then you may want to use Flexbox, because you can create more crazy kind of layouts where you've got certain rows are taller than others, and on and on and on. You can do that with Flexbox better. I still wouldn't use the columns element. I would just use a normal div with Flexbox and go from there if you're comfortable making those kinds of layouts. But if you just want simple 2 column, 3 column, 4 column, 5 column, 2/3 column, right? Like if I grab this wrapper right here and I take off that columns 3 and I just say, we're going to go columns 2, 3. Can I type? Columns 2. I hate this lag. I need a new computer. Columns 2, 3. Okay. You can see that I have so the first part of it is small. That's the 2 part. And then the 3 part makes it longer. So it's 2 columns with 1 short column and 1 wider column, right? And then you can make these go equal height by using stretch, which is not a problem. So if I and there's actually a class for that. So C stretch. So now we have equal heights, right? And I have a different kind of layout. Now, that's not the layout I wanted initially, but like I said, you can just create other types of grid layouts very easily with OxyNinja's classes. But that should be a good breakdown for you on columns versus grid, Flexbox versus grid, and then the fastest, easiest way to make grid layouts inside of Oxygen is with OxyNinja's utility classes, the core class system. So if you have any questions on this stuff, drop a comment below. Make sure you like, subscribe, all of that good stuff if you like this channel. Obviously, there's more Oxygen tutorials to come, also more agency tutorials to come. So if you're a freelancer, if you're an agency owner doing web design, SEO, digital marketing, I've got a ton of great, valuable content on the way. But for now, that's it. Peace.